Okay, class. Welcome to our first lecture on early Mesoamerican civilizations. Now, one thing I need to point out is the fact that we're going to start with the Olmecs, but know that we're only going to hit a few of the tribes of early Mesoamerican on into like the tribes that were around when the Spaniards arrived in the New World, but know that the area that is known as Latin America, anything south, and including just the Americas in general, were heavily populated by hundreds of, probably thousands of tribes who, at a certain point, through native disease, through European diseases and conquests, have long since disappeared. But a lot of them still remain in different, have been absorbed into other tribes or have just lost their identity, and in some ways are rediscovering their identity. Now, one of the first civilizations we're looking at is the Olmec civilization. This is really, a lot of people refer to these as the mother civilization. A lot of things that we see coming from the Olmec tribes have found their way and seeded their way into future Mesoamerican tribes of Latin America. But this is the one that we could really archaeologically see evidence of their cities, evidence that remains to this day that we can still look at and find. And one thing that really stands out as far as like Mesoamericans evidence that we have of their civilization is these huge stone colossal heads that we see throughout Mexico and into the Yucatan, and we're not quite sure who or what they represent. They could either be chiefs, gods, some important person. We're not quite sure, but we do know that they left quite a few of these in Mexico. Now, see, the next real rise of more of an organized civilization that we can look at and still see evidence of is Teotihuacan. Here you can see pyramids they left behind. We're guessing at the height this city held about 200,000 inhabitants. And when you're looking at like something that big, a population that large, we can infer a lot of things when you have 200,000 people living in one place. And we can look at it also, the Olmecs, and moving forward when we think about civilization is the fact if you have that many people living together, you have to have the very hallmarks of what we refer to as civilized society. You have to have a government. Somehow someone has to control that. You also have some sort of way to feed everyone, so a system of agriculture. And then usually with that comes language, with that comes some sort of culture, with that comes, some sort of religion. And as we look at these civilizations, know that these were civilizations. Too often, we look at Native American societies, and especially when Europeans look at them, they looked at them as less than human, savage, just because they looked, acted, or worshipped differently. But they had all the hallmarks of civilization. In fact, these areas that emerged, with these huge cities, were comparable to anything in Europe, even at that time, and they were in some cases ahead of Europeans' time. There are huge temples. One was dedicated to the sun, one's dedicated to the moon. Once again, when we look at especially large-scale early societies, agricultural societies, usually their religion is based around stuff like the stars, the sun, and the moon, because keeping track of time and seasons and change and stuff like that is crucial to knowing when to plant crops, when to bring them out. And then we see the emergence of the Mayan civilization. This is on the Yucatan Peninsula. The Mayans weren't really like, one huge empire in a sense. They were a grouping of city-states, much like the Greeks. Each one had its own ruler, but their culture, much like the Greeks, was very similar. They were polytheistic, meaning they worshipped many different gods. These guys were, excellent architects. We see little pyramids all over the Yucatan. They also developed a very sophisticated math counting system and, of course, calendar system. These city-states, popped up throughout the Yucatan, and you can see on the map there all these little labels of where they were. And so what we see here is stuff that rivals what would be going on in Europe, like a whole bunch of city states, some work together, some negotiated together. So once again, when you see, organizational structure like this, you see all the hallmarks of society, writing, language, government, civilization, religion, everything, art, everything that, you can check box as far as what civilization is, you can certainly check box when it comes to the Mayans. Let me And so, Mayans, like the city states, are usually ruled by kings that were usually much like, like the Egyptian kings who were supposed to be deities, or and this can be translated in Europe when you have the divine right of kings and stuff like that. You had noble classes, you had scribes, you had a striated society, division of labor. Once again, all the hallmarks of civilization. They had, government officials, artisans, merchants, farmers, soldiers, anything you would encounter as far as what really, a civilized society is, you would see with the Mayans. In fact, you'd see an advanced civilization in which they had schools and even had the written language. Excuse me, I got ahead of myself. Sorry about that. Now, the Mayan calendar, well, I'm sure you've all seen it. And one thing I want to point out before we get even deeper into talking about the Mayan calendar is the fact that it is circular. Now, there's a lot of calendars that are circular. Of course, you've seen the Aztec calendar and so forth. But it is mostly like a westernized European thinking when we talk about timelines, a straight line of time. A lot of societies believe in have more cyclic thought. They see things in cycles, like the Chinese had the dynastic cycle. So seeing things in a cyclic, concept, kind of like when we talk about history repeating itself. They see rises and falls, they see changes, and this is how they see time. Now, I'm not sure, if you recall or heard about what happened in the year 2000. Everyone, when we all thought that computers were going to shut down and everything because the computer code was written in such a way it was 1990, or they put in 1900 and everything was going to crash. Nothing bad happened, but in a much lesser case, but in the same kind of mass hysteria was in 2012 when the Mayan calendar ended and people were just starting to lose their minds, thinking the world was over. And it's really funny because none of these people actually believed in Mayan mythology, but this is the one thing they do believe for some reason or another. But really, that's just you can only make a calendar so far. I'm sorry, you can only make those circles so big. At a certain point, you're going to stop. And all stopping means to them is just another cycle. It doesn't mean the end of the world or anything like that. Like I said, they had many city-states scattered throughout the Yucatan, and here's Tikal, and you can see the temples. You can see, how it's like buried deep in the jungle. And a lot of times they're still discovering stuff in the jungle. Satellite imagery is helping us a lot. And then one other major city is Chichen Itza. There you can see more temples of different designs, not just the typical temple that you see in the bottom left corner. You can see one with a rounder top, and you can see, decorated with a jaguar, and of course the hoop game, and these are all hallmarks of a large city, where people would meet and trade and worship and have fun, play games. Here's some more images. Now, speaking of 2012, you see a lot of people up there, climbing up the pyramids. I'm not sure if you can do that now. I know after 2012, they banned people from climbing up there because, like I said, a lot of people lost their minds thinking the world was in, and there was a bunch of people that jumped off these things and committed suicide thinking the world was going to end. Now, the Aztec civilization are actually known as the Mexica. That's where Mexico gets its name from. A lot of names and stuff are actually Spanish interpretations of what they thought their names were. We see them. They're like the last big civilization to rise, right? Before the Spaniards arrive. And so we're looking at the rise around the 12th century. Much like the other ones, they built they had a very striated society. They had an emperor who was like a god. Their economy was based on agriculture, and they also conquered all the nearby tribes, which plays a role in the conquest later. So they accepted tribute from these territories. These are also like many different groups that they went to war with that later would become human sacrifices as well. Their main city Tenochtitlan was literally built in the middle of Lake Texcoco, and it had causeways, ways to get in, floating gardens. It was actually gardens that were built on sod, floating in the water. You literally could just like row alongside and pick the crops. Very interesting, complex society, great architecture. And this is just some of the images of what it would look like back in the day. Unfortunately, most of Mexico City is built on top of this area. But in the top corner, on the top right, you can see some of the causeways that were built to come in and out of the city. In the outer area with the floating gardens, the chiampas. And when you look at the Aztecs, at the very top, of course, you have the emperor, and he was supposed to be divine. Then you had, once again, like a division of labor, commoners, indentured servants, slaves, but you also had artisans, you also had clergy, you even had schools. And, this was, a society that would rival anything in Europe at the time. Um, by the time the Spaniards came, there were literally 4 million people living in the Aztec Empire, if you can believe that. This is a place of high concentration of populations. Men were warriors. Women were, were scholars, or some were, architects and other artisans. Women were usually at home. But the interesting thing about this is, unlike in Europe, women could actually inherit and own property inter contracts. In general, though, women would work with textiles, raise children, and would even be, priestess in the religion. And of course, this is the religion that the culture people closely attribute to sacrifice. Their concept of why they sacrificed and why it was done so frequently is they believe that in their mindset that as long as the blood was flowing, the time would continue to move forward. The sun would rise and set, the moon would come forward. This is kind of what drove time forward. And if they didn't do it, then the world would come to an end. And so there were time periods, and there was no one to sacrifice. They actually had people, volunteering to be sacrificial victims, like so that the rest of their society could live. And in fact, there's like beautiful poetry written by people that were about to be sacrificed about the honor of giving their lives so that their society can keep moving forward. And they did practice large scale human sacrifice by the thousands at times every year. Sometimes it would speed up, sometimes it would slow down. Usually, reasons it would speed up is like because of crop failure or other natural disasters that they were experiencing. And these are just some of the remnants and artifacts of the Aztec Empire. On the top, you can see the obsidian knife. Obsidian is a rock that you find around volcanoes, super sharp. And this is what their weapons were made out of. Also, like the tools for sacrifice and other things. But this is a super sharp rock. And you can see other pieces of artwork and images from that, from their time. And finally, you have the Incan civilization. The Inca was the largest land civilization in all of Mesoamerica. They were all along the coast of South America. Much like the Aztecs themselves had conquered all that territory, subjugated all other tribes to and brought them within the Incan Empire. Excuse me. The capital city was Cusco. They were pretty much scattered throughout the mountains and had an interesting series of roads to interconnect the whole society. They divided their kingdoms into different territories that were governed by governors and who always would be under the emperor. And this is how they were able to keep their empire together, by kind of like this division of government. They also practiced high altitude agriculture. They were polytheistic. One thing also that they practiced as well is also had you can look at a series of writing I'll get into in a second. But here you can see an image of the series of roads that were built throughout. Some are still standing, some are still cleared out. This is would take you and interconnect the empire, which will allow soldiers to move back and forward so they can inspect places, hold the empire together, much like the Roman army did. They built Rome roads going everywhere to interconnect the empire and to hold it together. Um, we're looking at about over 24,000 miles of roads. There were little bridges and places to stop and rest all along the empire and the trail. And when it comes to their culture, this is what I wanted to point out earlier. Women, they were required to remain within the social group. You had a very striated society, and much like the Aztecs, the women could be priestess as well as stay at home. A lot of them were farmers. They did have some domesticated animals such as the llamas and the alpacas. And here you can see an image of quipu, which was a record keeping system and system of writing for the Inca, which was a series of strings and knots, which together would help them keep track of numbers or certain messages that were written out. And a lot of times, most people wouldn't recognize it as writing, but that's what it is, just in a different form that we're used to seeing. And they were great builders. And when you think about like where they're building at the tops of these mountains, high altitude, they mastered step farming, which is you can see this tier level farming there in one of the images. Just these beautiful images, but well, you got to understand is like, man, they're high up there. You can think about oxygen levels and stuff. Yet they were able to build these magnificent structures. And the highest Machu Picchu at its highest is 8,000 feet above sea level. And here's some more images of the Incan Empire, Machu Picchu, and just the type of genius and the intelligence and the mathematical skills that you would need to build such a society, and even maintain an agricultural system in this area. These were people that were highly intelligent. So when we look at what remains, what do we still have today, and we have all kinds of mathematics that we can link to these early pioneers and types of writing and languages that still are around. The calendar system that they built, these were in all, like I mentioned before, in every shape, way, or form with their own civilization. Too often we look at civilization through other lenses, but we have to also justify and validate the lives and civilization of others. Civilization does not always have to look like we look. People don't always have to dress or act or worship the way we do. Thank you.